Sarah Hayes stood in the doorway of her modest Georgia cabin, staring at the 3 children she had fed, nursed, and raised for 17 years. They called her Mommy, never Mother. But that humid August morning in 1869, when federal investigators finally unsealed the plantation records, she discovered something that would shatter everything she believed about her life. The documents revealed dates, names, and a truth so disturbing that 2 county officials refused to speak of it publicly. What Sarah learned that day would force her to confront a question no mother should ever have to answer. Were they truly her master's children? Or had she been deceived in ways far more sinister than she could have imagined? Before we continue with the story of Sarah Hayes and the horrifying secret hidden in those plantation records, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We bring you the darkest, most compelling true stories from America's past, and tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Together, let's discover what really happened on the Grand Anthem estate. The autumn Sarah Hayes arrived at the Grand Anthem plantation was unremarkable in every way except one. She was 19 years old, recently purchased at auction in Savannah, and visibly pregnant. The year was 1852, and the estate sprawled across 800 acres of red Georgia clay, producing cotton and corn in quantities that made Charles Grantham one of the wealthier landowners in Burke County. The main house stood 3 stories tall, painted white with black shutters that never seemed to close completely, giving the windows a perpetually watchful appearance. Charles Grantham was 43, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier along with their infant son. The loss had transformed him from a gregarious host known for elaborate dinner parties into a reclusive figure who spent most evenings in his study reviewing ledgers by candlelight and drinking whiskey. The household staff whispered that he blamed himself, that he'd insisted his wife travel to Savannah late in her pregnancy against the doctor's advice. Before the owner's bankruptcy forced the sale of all his assets, including the 12 people he'd enslaved, Sarah had belonged to a smaller farm near Augusta. She never spoke of the father of her unborn child, and no one asked. Such questions were considered impolite among the enslaved community. Everyone carried wounds too deep for casual conversation. The overseer, a thin man named Porter with permanently sunburned forearms, assigned Sarah to work in the main house under the supervision of Dinah, the head of household staff who'd served the Grantham family for 26 years. Dinah was in her 50s, gray-haired and efficient, with a stern demeanor that concealed a capacity for unexpected kindness. She took one look at Sarah's condition and assigned her to light duties, mending clothes, preparing vegetables, tending the herb garden behind the kitchen. "You'll work until you can't," Dinah told her matter-of-factly. "Then you'll rest until you can work again. That's how we survive here. Mr. Grantham don't tolerate laziness, but he ain't cruel like some. You do your work, keep your head down, you'll be treated fair enough." Sarah discovered this was largely true. The Grantham plantation operated with cold efficiency rather than brutality. There were rules. No one entered the main house through the front door. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one was permitted in Mr. Grantham's study under any circumstances. But the food rations were adequate, the cabins had solid roofs, and Porter rarely used his whip. It was a kind of prison where the bars were invisible, but no less real. In January of 1853, Sarah gave birth to a son she named Thomas. Dinah attended the delivery along with an elderly woman named Ruth, who'd brought more than 80 babies into the world. The labor lasted 14 hours. When it was over, Sarah held her son and felt something she hadn't experienced since her own mother had been sold away when she was 12, hope. Perhaps not for herself, but for this small life that knew nothing yet of the world's cruelty. She returned to work when Thomas was 3 weeks old, strapping him to her back in the traditional way, the rhythm of her movements lulling him to sleep while she worked. Mr. Grantham never acknowledged the child's presence. To him, Sarah was simply another piece of property that had produced another piece of property, valuable only insofar as both could work. The seasons turned. Sarah proved herself capable and reliable, qualities that earned her grudging respect from the other household staff. She learned the family's preferences. Mr. Grantham took his coffee black with 2 spoons of sugar, preferred his shirt starched to near stiffness, and would not eat fish on Wednesdays for reasons no one could explain. She learned to move through the house like a ghost, visible only when needed, invisible the rest of the time. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child who asked too many questions. By the time he was 3, he'd learned to read from studying the newspapers that lined the kindling box, teaching himself letters and then words with a determination that worried Sarah. Literacy was dangerous for enslaved people in Georgia. The state had laws against teaching them to read, laws backed by severe punishments. But she couldn't bring herself to discourage his hunger for knowledge. Instead, she taught him to hide it, to never let white people see him reading, to pretend ignorance even when he understood everything being discussed around him. Smart can keep you alive, she told him. But showing you're smart can get you killed. Remember that, Thomas. Always remember that. In the spring of 1855, everything changed. Mr. Grantham announced his engagement to Margaret Vance, the 28-year-old daughter of a prominent judge from Augusta. The household exploded into preparation. Every room was cleaned and repainted. New furniture was ordered from Savannah. The gardens were redesigned by a landscape architect from Charleston. Margaret Vance arrived in June with 14 trunks, 2 personal maids, and expectations that would reshape the entire plantation. She was beautiful in the way of delicate china, with pale skin, auburn hair, and green eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. But there was something brittle about her, a quality Sarah recognized because she'd seen it in abused horses, the constant expectation of pain, the readiness to flinch. The wedding took place in July, a grand affair attended by more than 200 guests. Sarah worked in the kitchen for 3 days straight, preparing dishes she'd never tasted, roasted duck with cherry sauce, 7-layer cakes, custards flavored with vanilla and almond. She watched through the kitchen window as the guests danced on the lawn, their laughter carrying on the humid evening air. It seemed like a scene from another world entirely, one where people could afford to be careless with happiness. Margaret took control of the household with surprising firmness. She rearranged staff assignments, implemented new schedules, and insisted on European-style service that required extensive retraining. She was neither kind nor cruel, simply distant, as if the enslaved people who surrounded her daily were pieces of furniture that happened to move and speak. But she was particularly distant with Sarah. She never looked directly at her, never addressed her by name, referred to her only as the girl, even though Sarah was by then 22 years old. Dinah noticed, but offered no explanation, only a warning, stay out of her sight much as you can. Some folks got their reasons for the way they are, and those reasons ain't our concern. A year after the wedding, Margaret announced she was pregnant. The household's atmosphere transformed overnight. Mr. Grantham, who'd been somber for years, suddenly smiled at dinner, ordered imported wines, and spoke enthusiastically about the future. Margaret withdrew even further, spending most of her time in her rooms, seeing no one but her personal maids and the doctor who visited weekly from Augusta. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret suffered constant nausea, headaches so severe she couldn't tolerate light or sound, and fainting spells that left her unconscious for hours. The doctor prescribed bed rest and laudanum, both of which she embraced with an intensity that worried the household staff. In March of 1857, she went into labor. The screaming could be heard throughout the entire house, terrible sounds that seemed to last forever. Sarah, working in the kitchen, felt her stomach clench with each cry. She remembered her own labor with Thomas, the pain that had felt like dying. But Margaret's screams had a different quality, something beyond physical pain, something that sounded like fury. After 23 hours, a baby girl was born. They named her Caroline. But Margaret refused to hold her. She refused to nurse her. She turned her face to the wall and told Mr. Grantham to get the infant out of her sight. The doctor examined Margaret and declared her suffering from nervous exhaustion, a condition that would require months of rest and isolation to cure. He prescribed increased doses of laudanum and complete separation from the baby until she recovered. No one questioned this. Postpartum melancholia was common enough, particularly after difficult births. Mr. Grantham stood in his study that night, holding his newborn daughter, completely at a loss. She needed to be fed. She needed constant care. The wet nurse they'd arranged had died 2 weeks earlier from pneumonia, and there wasn't time to find another before the baby starved. Dinah solved the problem. She knocked on the study door and said 5 words, "Sarah can nurse the child." Sarah was in her cabin when Dinah came for her. She was nursing Thomas, who was 4 years old and still sometimes wanted the comfort of his mother's breast before sleep. Dinah explained the situation with her characteristic bluntness. Mrs. Grantham couldn't care for baby Caroline. Mr. Grantham needed a wet nurse. Sarah was still nursing Thomas, which meant she had milk. It wasn't a request. It was never a request. Sarah felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She'd heard stories of enslaved women forced to nurse white babies while their own children starved. She'd heard of women whose bodies gave all their milk to their master's children, leaving nothing for their own. But she had no choice. So she stood up, wrapped Thomas in a blanket, and followed Dinah through the dark to the main house. Mr. Grantham met them in the nursery, a room that had been hastily prepared on the second floor. He held Caroline awkwardly, the way men hold babies when they are terrified of breaking them. The infant was screaming, her face red and pinched with hunger. "Feed her," he said to Sarah, and left the room. Sarah sat in the rocking chair and arranged her clothing. She'd fed Thomas just minutes earlier, but she pressed the screaming infant to her breast and felt the small mouth latch on with desperate strength. The crying stopped. The room filled with the sound of suckling and Sarah's own racing heartbeat. Thomas, who'd been silent and wide-eyed through the entire exchange, whispered, "Mama." "Hush now," Sarah told him. "Everything's going to be all right." But she knew, even as she spoke the words, that she was lying. Nothing was going to be all right. She could feel it in the way baby Caroline fed with such intensity, such hunger, as if she meant to take everything Sarah had. And in the months that followed, she nearly did. The arrangement began simply enough. Sarah would come to the main house every 4 hours to nurse Caroline. Between feedings, she could return to her cabin to care for Thomas and handle her other duties. But within a week, the schedule had changed. Mr. Grantham decided it was inefficient for Sarah to travel back and forth. She was moved into a small room adjacent to the nursery, a servant's chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that overlooked the back gardens. Thomas was left in the cabin with an elderly woman named Mattie, who looked after several children while their parents worked. Sarah saw him only briefly each day, usually in the early morning or late evening when Dinah could spare her for an hour. Each time Thomas seemed smaller to her, more distant, as if he were slowly disappearing from her life. "Don't forget me, Mama," he said one evening. And Sarah's heart broke in 2 pieces. "Never," she promised. "I could never forget you. You're my son, my own boy." But Caroline became her entire world by necessity. Newborns are relentless, demanding creatures, and Caroline was no exception. She nursed every 2 hours, day and night, for months. She had colic that made her scream for hours until Sarah learned to lay her on her stomach across her lap and rub her back in slow circles. She developed a rash that covered her entire body, requiring constant baths and applications of calomel ointment. She wouldn't sleep unless someone was holding her. So Sarah learned to sleep sitting upright in the rocking chair, the baby against her chest, waking at the slightest movement. Mr. Grantham visited the nursery daily, usually in the evening. He would stand over the cradle and watch Caroline sleep with an expression Sarah couldn't interpret. It wasn't exactly love. It was more like surveillance, as if he were checking to make sure she still existed. He never asked about Thomas. He never acknowledged that Sarah had her own child who needed her. To him, she was simply a function, a source of nutrition for his daughter, as impersonal as a bottle or a feeding schedule. Margaret never came to the nursery. According to the maids who attended her, she spent her days in bed, drifting in and out of laudanum dreams, occasionally asking about the weather or what was being served for dinner, but never mentioning her daughter. The doctor continued his weekly visits and pronounced her condition unchanged, nervous exhaustion requiring complete rest and isolation. As Caroline grew, Sarah found herself developing feelings she'd never expected. Affection, tenderness, even a kind of love for this child who wasn't hers. She told herself it was natural, that any woman who spends every waking moment caring for an infant would form an attachment. But it felt more complicated than that. It felt like a betrayal of Thomas, of herself, of everything she believed about survival and resistance in a system designed to destroy both. When Caroline was 6 months old, Margaret died. She'd taken too much laudanum one evening, whether intentionally or accidentally, no one could say. They found her in the morning, pale and cold in her elaborate bed, her face peaceful for perhaps the first time since her wedding day. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by prominent families from across the region. Mr. Grantham stood beside the grave with Caroline in his arms, stone-faced and silent. Sarah watched from a distance, holding Thomas's hand, feeling the guilt of being glad that Margaret was gone, because it meant Caroline would need her even more completely now. After Margaret's death, the household settled into a new rhythm. Mr. Grantham became both father and mother to Caroline, though in practice this meant Sarah continued to provide all actual care while he made decisions about her upbringing. He hired a tutor for when she'd be old enough for lessons. He ordered elaborate dresses from Savannah and Charleston. He commissioned a portrait painter to capture her image every year on her birthday. When Caroline was 2, Mr. Grantham married again, this time to a widow named Helen Bradford from Macon. Helen was 41, practical rather than beautiful, with 3 grown children from her first marriage and no interest in having more. She ran the household with efficient indifference, neither cruel nor kind, simply ensuring everything functioned smoothly. She never interfered with Sarah's care of Caroline. 2 years after that marriage, Helen gave birth unexpectedly to twins, a boy and a girl they named Robert and Elizabeth. The pregnancy had been a surprise, the delivery quick and without complications. Helen recovered rapidly, but she had no interest in nursing. She'd hired a wet nurse for her first 3 children and saw no reason to change that practice now. Except there was a problem. The wet nurse they'd arranged became ill with influenza and couldn't take the position. And Sarah was still nursing Caroline, who was 4 but refused to be weaned. Mr. Grantham made the obvious decision. Sarah would nurse all 3 children. Dinah brought Sarah the news with an apologetic expression. "I know it ain't right," she said quietly. "I know it ain't fair. But you know how it is." Sarah did know. She always knew. She took the twins into her care, arranged them on her lap with Caroline curled against her side, and fed them all while Thomas watched from the doorway with eyes that had grown old far too young. He was 9 years old now, tall and thin, working in the fields because he was too old for the cabin nursery and too young for skilled work. "You got 3 children now," he said to her one evening, his voice flat. "White children. Must be nice having children that matter." "Thomas, no," Sarah reached for him, but he stepped back. "It's fine, Mama. I understand how it works. I've always understood." He left the room, and Sarah sat in the darkness with Caroline sleeping against her shoulder, feeling the truth of his words like a knife between her ribs. The years passed. Caroline grew into a bright, affectionate child who called Sarah Mammy and seemed genuinely fond of her. See you in the next video.